On behalf of the University of Sydney, Architecture, Design and Planning, I would like to welcome you all, those here in person, online, this evening, this morning, this day, wherever it finds you, to this third session in the inaugural Lacaton Vassal Chair Symposium. For those of us who are here in the recently opened Charter Museum that houses the collection at the University of Sydney, I've got a couple of notes for you. The event is being filmed, as is relatively obvious, and will be going online and recorded very soon. But also, should there be an emergency, the museum staff will safely get us out of here, I'm very pleased to say. But before I launch into the discussion about living well and living together, I think it's especially poignant to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose ancestral lands the university is built. As a recently returned Australian looking at this land anew, I'm especially humbled by the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country, and hope we can all aspire to work with and learn from the traditional owners who have cared for and continue to care for country. My name is Kate Goodwin. I'm Professor of Practice at Sydney University, and I'm going to be your host for this session. Until last week, I was the Head of Architecture and Heinz Curator of Architecture in London at the Royal Academy of Arts. And for the last 17 years, I've been working on a project, a program of major exhibitions, publications, activations that really stimulate a public discussion about architecture, which I think is so central, which is also what is really the spirit of this symposium that we are joined here today. Lacaton Vassal have been curating this three-day symposium, of which we are halfway through in this third session, that focuses on exemplar, social and affordable housing design, something that, as they say, citizens have the right to expect in everyday life. And it's something that we want to celebrate and highlight the great examples, but they also equally acknowledge the scale and complexity of the challenge that is faced in this, and that by linking Europe and Australia, Paris and Sydney, we can learn what happens in each of these situations and come together to discuss shared questions and hopefully to uncover solutions. And one of these questions for us tonight is to ask what new typologies might offer in rethinking social housing, so that it adds to the quality of life of citizens and contributes to our cities. And so in some ways, it's both a celebration of cities and the metropolis, the sort of innovation, the excitement, the inspiration and advancement that happens in these dense urban environments, but also the complexity that comes with in its inevitable challenges. But also, as they say, by prioritising the enrichment of human life, which is central to this idea. It's about life. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. And ask questions about how to live well. Lacaton Vassal, who you will know no doubt as the very recent winners of the Pritzker Prize, celebrate and champion the transformation of what we already have, the buildings, the infrastructure, the landscape around, the networks, and in doing so ask us to look again, to think again, which is what our three speakers tonight will do. We're here to discuss, as I said, these different housing models, thinking about spatial typologies, but as much also about different attitudes, different modes of practice for the architect, not to accept the status quo. It's changing the discussion. It's a think to the extent to which perhaps even words or language that is used might have an influence. And it's in large measure about refocusing the discussion in such a way that it puts the people, the inhabitants, at the forefront of the discussion. We have Irene Chalbert, who will look at historic examples of housing in Ivry sur Seine by the architects Gailhoustet and Renaudie. Sophie Delhay, who's going to talk about two projects at different scales. One she did about 15 years ago in Nantes, and another just more recently completed in Dijon, which has won the prestigious French Pritzker Prize for housing. And Christoph Houtin, who's going to talk about two projects across two different phases. And I'm very delighted to say we'll be joined in the panel by Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal. And there's a number of strands, I think, that will run through all three of these presentations. Architects rethinking their role, what it is about practice, taking agency in it, not just designing buildings, but designing systems, approaches, occupations, and thinking about what their skills as spatial practitioners bring to this discussion. I think there's quite a strong conversation here about ethics and ethics of practice and where you place emphasis and what you stand for as a practice. Very much a thread that comes out is the importance of the relationship of a good client, and also very much thinking about thinking up a sort of bottom-up mentality rather than just a sort of top-down one. But I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Irénée Scalbert, who's an eminent architecture critic and historian, trained himself as an architect and is based in London. And he's taught for many years at the Architectural Association, has been incredibly influential there, and after a pause has returned back to teaching. I'm very pleased to say I know everyone in London is delighted about. He's also taught at the Harvard GSD, at the Politecnico in Milan, and he's author of a book of A Right to Difference, The Architecture of Jean Renaudie, which was published in 2004, and Never Modern, the work of the architect 6A, which was published in 2013, and a more recent series of essays called A Real Living Contact with Things Themselves, that talked about what it is to be in buildings. So without further ado, Irénée, over to you.
And for inviting me, that's very nice. Now I will start straight away and share my screen. And minimize this. Very good. Now, I will start with this controversial document, the Charter of Athens, which some of you may know. It so happened that it is actually a document which I very much admire. It is what I would regard as a charter of urban rights, and in fact, the writing of this charter is contemporary with the Charter of Human Rights, which was actually worked on and eventually enshrined at the United Nations. This may be something which might come in the discussion at some point. Now, the legacy of the Charter of Athens is most problematic in what the French call the grands ensembles, and which translates in English as mass housing. And this housing projects became emblematic of modern urbanism, and for instance, these 7,000 dwellings which have been built near Metz in the east of France. And many of these projects were designed by the most renowned architects of the time, and among them names that might be familiar with you, for instance, Marcel Lotz and Jean Dubuisson, who actually did his very large estate, and Fernand Pouillon, who has recently become well known. And those are among the names which have been remembered by historians. Now, some of these estates remain much the same as they were after completion. And among them, here are 2,600 dwellings of the so-called Résidence du Parc by Fernand Pouillon. And also here, the 1,500 dwellings of the so-called Grande Terre by Marcel Lotz. Here you see a photograph at the time, and here a more recent photograph, which I took a few months ago. And I should say that both of those estates remain as successful today as they were when completed, at least successful in their own terms. Now, all of these projects subscribe to the pursuit of standards and include a small number of dwelling types. For instance, the 1,500 apartments of the Grande Terre, the project on the screen, include, amazingly, only 3 different apartment types. And so more than the actual scale of these estates, it was, I think, the extremely limited choice of apartments on offer that actually began the critique in the 1970s and eventually the decline of mass housing. Now, what made the architects I have been asked to refer to today, Jean Renaudie, extraordinary, when I first became interested in his work in the 1990s, was his unequivocal stand against wholesale repetition. And nothing, in his view, could justify the alignment of housing with the logic of mass production. And in his view, this was actually a poisonous legacy of the modern movement. And so in housing, no less than in politics, nothing could justify the restriction on human individuality by industry. It was logical, therefore, from his point of view, to remove the cross walls that were typical of modern housing construction in France and elsewhere. And here you see a project for the resorption of slums in the north of Paris, on which Renaudie actually worked. By then, he still used cross walls. And you can see them on this plan, and oops, wrong way. And here is a detail of this plan where you can see the cross wall are still there with some modifications starting to be made in the plan. Now, the events of May 68, which you may be familiar with, which took place in France, were a boost in so many ways in French society, notably for the values of solidarity and also the values of individualism. And both of those values are really central to the work of Jean Renaudie. And so cross walls seem to be an obstacle to both those values. And Renaudie felt very, very strongly, as I said, that they had to go. And ultimately, and that's one of the main points I wish to make tonight, is the notion of type in housing. And in Renaudie's work, I quote, "If you make typical plans, you must then invent typical inhabitants," which of course is not a possibility. And that is, Renaudie used to say that he had no idea who the tenants were, and more generally, who the people actually were. And to quote from him again, he used to say, "Les gens, je ne connais pas," meaning people, I do not know who they are. Now, and I think this is entirely rational from the point of view of a housing architect, or in most situations, how could an architect know tenants who move into a building only after that building has been completed? Now, each human being essentially different, each dwelling must necessarily also be different. This was actually the position of Renaudie. And here you see the marvelous plan of the first breakthrough in Renaudie's architecture of the Casanova building in Ivry, completed 1972. And so not only should the dwellings be different, but he argued that each moment, each life situation being unique, therefore each space in the city, in other words, not only housing, each space in the city must necessarily be unique too. And the places which he admired, for instance, the Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy in France, helped him together with other places to actually confirm this view about the value of the uniqueness of places. Now, even by the standards of today, his refusal to make exceptions to the uniqueness of everything, every dwelling, every space, and his insistence on systematic difference, I think still seems radical. And there has been, I think, still to this day, very few imitations of his works. This is also something which some of us might be interested in discussing later. Renaudie's intention found an echo in ideas that became also current in the 1990s. Here in the Netherlands, architects like MVRDV, and you see one of their projects here, responded to the liberalization of the housing market, which took place in that country at that time. And so this project was a milestone. In fact, they described it as their manifesto. And it was a competition entry for a site in Berlin. And MVRDV promoted diversity in ways that, in my view, recall the diversity which was achieved some 20 years before by Jean Renaudie in France. Now, the project description for what you see on the screen points to the impacts of a very well-known German sociologist and a man whose work I think is exceedingly interesting from the point of view of housing, called Ulrich Beck. And the text by MVRDV refers notably to, quote, dwelling careers, by which it meant that in one's life, one moves from one dwelling to another. And the expression dwelling careers actually comes directly from the work of Ulrich Beck. And so they referred to a desire for choice as one moves from home to home. And in hindsight, the extreme character of the dwellings, which you see on this section, seems to have more to do with polemics than it did with sociology. And it is reflected in the arbitrariness of the 34 types made available in the project, so to speak, in limited editions. And so those different types of dwellings were given names such as snake house, cactus house, leapfrog house, and many others. I think in this way, referring to the arbitrariness of the design of those homes. Now, the approach in this project was very much the same at Silodam, the project which MVRDV completed in the early 2000s. And this project includes actually 20 different types. And there is, I think, the same arbitrariness in the design of this block as there was in the one we saw previously. The lead architect, the partner at MVRDV, Nathalie de Vries, describes this project as, I quote, a museum of housing type. And the implication, I think, is clear. This is a detailed plan of the block, 4 stories of this block. I think the implication of the idea of a museum is clear. The idea of type is one, in their view, that clearly belongs in the past. It has been made obsolete by individualization. The term was invented by Ulrich Beck, and also by the disappearance of traditional social classes. Only, therefore, differences in the spatial quality of dwellings actually matter. Now, in my view, individualization is here to stay. We are not going to go backwards in the social trends. And to illustrate this, here I include a marvelous drawing by Saul Steinberg of the city of New York. Now, it is really hard to my mind to see how the genie of individualization could actually been put back in the bottle. And in turn, I think also that it is reasonable to expect that individualization will be reflected in the form of our building and also in the spaces of our city. Now, I should emphasize that in my mind, it is not an invitation to actually imitate the work of Renaudie. And so, in fact, I think that the design procedure used by Jean Renaudie can appear at times systematic, even obsessive. And what you see on the screen is a plan by Jean Renaudie for a new town in the south of France, a place called Vitrolles. This was not actually built, but you can actually get a sense of what I mean by obsessiveness. Now, paradoxically, in an architecture that cultivates difference in all things, it is, I think, the underlying principle and the way it manifests itself in a few constants that appear in his work especially successful. And here you see the plans of 6 apartments from one of the buildings at Ivry-sur-Seine to the edge of Paris, which I have put to illustrate this point. Now, most apartments in these blocks are duplexes, so this is one permanent. The layout of all those apartments are functionally non-prescriptive, and so any aspect of everyday life is allowed to take place anywhere in the plan. This is an approach to housing which I think is gaining traction in recent years. And also all apartments have multiple orientations, which I think is a significant progress after the standard east-west orientation of most modern housing. And last, all those apartments have at least one planted terrace, and usually more than one. Now, it is worth pointing out that there is actually no contradiction between insisting, on the one hand, on the value of difference, and on the other, in searching for guiding principles in the design of housing. To my mind, this is a very important point, and I think it needs emphasizing because it seems at first sight contradictory. Now, future inhabitants in any housing projects are being by definition unknown, as Renaudie actually kept emphasizing. Architects must always make assumptions about who, or rather how, a dwelling should be designed. In other words, they must generalize. They must search for universals in the field of housing. And this brings us back to my very first slide, to the Charter of Athens and to its universalist aspirations, just like the Charter of Human Rights likewise has universalist aspirations. Now, Renaudie's response to this difficulty was to say that he was actually ultimately designing for himself. The design of an apartment was complete, in his view, when he himself was willing to live inside it. And when Renaudie designs a flat as if it were for himself, he also designs it for others. Here is a moral point, which is that what is good for others should also be good for oneself. And Renaudie was very much true to his words and always lived in the housing blocks which he was designing. Now, in recent years, it has been assumed that all human beings being equal, all differences are equivalent. For instance, there is no suggestion that some of the plans at Xylodams, the MVRDV project I showed earlier, are better than others. Now, I do not see it this way. I think this is a wrong assumption. Differences may be infinite in numbers, but this does not make them arbitrary. And here on the screen you have, again, I think a very wonderful plan of the upper floor of the Jeanne Hachette building in Ivry-sur-Seine to the south of Paris, completed by Jean Renaudie in 1974. And if you look from the right of this plan, looking that way, in fact, from this floor here, this is the view you get on this large housing complex. Now, clearly, in my view, some differences are more valuable than others. And it is here that the role of the architects assumes its full significance. The architects create not any difference, but hopefully the best possible differences in a given situation. And just to conclude this, I would say that difference and the manner in which it is inscribed in a particular situation is at the heart of design. Perhaps even more strongly, one might say that it is the heart of design. So that is what I wanted to say, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, René. And we are now going to hear from our second speaker, Sophie Delhay, who graduated from ENSAP in Lille in 1999. She was the laureate of the new Albums of Young Architects in 2006, co-founder of Boxcop Architect, where she was a project manager of some experimental housing in Nantes that we're going to hear about. And then she set up her own agency, Sophie Delhay Architecture, in Paris in 2010. She's also an educator teaching at the National School of Architecture in Nantes and also at Versailles. So Sophie, over to you.
So I share the screen. Is it okay for you?
Perfect, thank you.
So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk to you about housing at a time when the world is changing very fast, and when paradoxically the construction of housing design no longer evolves not so quickly. In fact, this is due to standards, to building habits, but also the conventional vision of the programs that we receive as architects. And in France, we work in very modest conditions with small surfaces, and every decade surfaces and budget decrease, and programs are still based on a single outdated family model and standard multiply. And the standard obliges to adapt the housing to the thermal problems, to adapt to disabilities, for example, to adapt to many things that are very important, but which ultimately produced housing that is unadapt for a daily life at home, for the pleasure of being alone or together, and with the possibility of inviting one's own inner world and one's own links with the others, and adapt to the pleasure to link the interior and exterior spaces. So to talk about housing design, naturally, I will first of all talk about the inhabitants and the society. So what you see here are two major changes, and first you know it, but we are more and more on Earth, and to preserve the land, the density is an obligation, a sort of a new condition. So the question could be, how can we live together on this Earth? How can density become a sort of opportunities for new communities, for neighbors communities, of course, but also the communities within the house at all scales, in fact. And secondly, what you see here, that is the society is becoming atomized, individualized. So you can see how we are moving away from what we might call a conventional household with a mother, father, and children, and the very little unities now. So, in fact, we could say it's a pity, but new solidarities, new sort of links, other agglomerations are forming quite freely. And this is the good news. Today, couples come and go and create new forms of home, less hierarchical, more complex, with each other's children and each living independently. And the generations are multiplied for 3 to 5, and we can live together in different spectrum between students, older people, or between generations. Teleworking and digital tools also bring the public sphere into the private one. So here I can make a public lecture from Paris, for example. In my office, we work on these issues in different ways. So I've chosen to show you 2 projects that propose dwellings composed of unassigned spaces, unprogrammed one. So you will see that these projects look like a quite strict project, and in fact, they are quite a permissive one. These are social housing units, which are intended for renting, and therefore a situation in which we as architects find ourselves in a sort of complicated situation, since we do not meet the inhabitants and they cannot intervene in their housing. So we are working on typology, as you will see, which try to offer a maximum of freedom to the future inhabitants, so they can each project themselves quite freely in their housing. We therefore try to de-standard the order of our clients, to take a step aside to typologies. So both are dense urban propositions where density is turned on equality to bring people together. So first one is for 40 social housing in Dijon. And in fact, it's not a project of 40 dwellings, but a project of 240 rooms. And within the budget of the operation, we managed to reserve about 10 rooms for a large common room to all the inhabitants. So on the one part, we've done a sort of atomization of the program, and on the other parts, this was a sort of a strategy to never use the words housing or dwelling during our discussions with the clients. and accept this proposition, because we want to get him and us too out of our reflexes to look for new horizons for the quality of housing design. So we worked and proposed to discuss with him through two scales: the room, the little scale, the room of the dwelling, with the question of intimacy. So it's what you see here, and the urban room, which is a questions of sharings and the city. So we thought it was a good way to design a housing that was a dance between the small and the large scale. And the room has become our tool to dialogue with the client and to work, in fact. So here you can see a dwelling broken down into equal rooms. And in fact, we've atomised the program, and except for the kitchen and for the bathroom, which are half fixed, half room, each room is unprogrammed. And one of them is outside. It's a loggia or a terrace. The dwellings are therefore a sort of a collection of identical rooms, and the inhabitants settles as they want. So these rooms are connected or disconnected by large sliding rooms, which allows the creation of double rooms for the living room, for example. It's also allows everyone to choose freely whether to be alone or together. The exterior rooms with the kitchen, which is naturally lit and ventilated with its pass-through window, and the terraces. So you see, if you choose two rooms, for example, for the two bedrooms, you still have two rooms for the living room. And depending on the place you choose for the rooms, you can choose to free up views across the room, for example, or diagonally, or around the exterior one. Here are the three specials configurations. And through the day, the space can evolve according to the people who are there, according to the uses of the spaces. And each room is a sort of small individual living room, but can also open up into a large common area. It's also possible to live differently, of course, and with shared flats or co-working, for example, and sometimes even one of the rooms can also have its own access for a small office, for example. So all the dwellings are different, and some of them are strange because one room is detached, for example, in this type. One room is detached from the principal part of the dwelling. You will find this proposition in the other project I will present. All the dwellings are different and are all arranged in a repetitive structure, but it's not a repetitive project because each room has its own quality, its solar orientation, its view, or its relation to the other rooms of the dwelling. And to vary the pleasures, we have created two types of window. These are inhabited windows where everyone can extract themselves from their home and connect directly with the outside world. So the storage units are placed against the facade, and this forms a kind of hiding place. So here, intimacy is not at the back of the house, it's like in a cave, but intimacy is projected on the front. So on the garden side, it's a bench where one can dream. We designed the facade from the inside. And from the street side, it's an alcove with a curtain that allows me to extract myself completely. I can enter in this space, close the curtain, and be alone in the streets, but from home. It's a kind of a strong relationship between oneself from the world. I like this direct connection between the intimate and the public, the little and the large scale, without the intermediate threshold of the community interfering. This is a contemporary condition, and Riken Yamamoto says it better in Cell City in this little design. So here is the building. It's a kind of a big step because it is situated between small houses and future hall building. And the urban situation is a non-mixed area, quite sad in fact. So we propose to lay out the shared space on the boulevard side and to make it accessible to the whole neighborhood by creating a neighborhood association. So the urban planner had initially proposed to make a sort of collective building on the streets and houses in the bottom of the garden. And I confess that I have a little trouble with the split between the two categories where one would be privileged and not the other. So the building integrates, So the building integrates in a unique envelope individual, grouped and collective access, a way to live differently together. So this is the garden side and the future street side. And on the boulevard side, the shared space perched in the treetops. So the other project is 55 dwellings in Nantes. The project is my first project made with my ancient office, Boskop. And we proposed a sort of a flat collective building so that everyone would have an individual garden and could live like in a house. But in this project with this 120 dwellings per hectare is comparable to a block of flats with a collective garden. So the site is between pavilion houses and a park, and we divided the site into equal strips with an alternation between construction and gardens. So in red and blue, you can find 55 houses and see the density. Our in pink is comparable to a collective one. So what is special in this project is that the garden is not what separates us from the others, but rather it's a sort of a connector. And it's what makes the density of the operation. So the dwellings are a collection of identical rooms, like in the other project, and they're programmed. And one of them is detached and placed on the other side of the garden. So the garden is finally one of the pieces of the collection. So you don't live in one building, but mainly in one building and a bit in another one. And there is a kind of elsewhere at home for the teenager, for working on, I don't know why, what. And in fact, in this way, everybody already lives in the whole block. So this is 10 strips of a building that are divided in 5 couples that you see here. The dwelling living on either side of their private garden. These are intimate gardens because none of the neighbors' windows overlook your garden. And between these couples, there are public streets which allow the block to be crossed by the little houses to the public park. So the block is porous. And between other couples, you find common gardens for dwellings, and people don't go home through this shared garden, but through the private one. So you go in the shared one only if you want to be with the others. And in fact, we seek to use density for its ability to bring people together and look for ways in which they can share their common territory. So we want to make sure that the building is not just a sort of a multiplication of dwellings without any other elements that walls and fences. For us, it's important to protect the intimacy of each person, but on the condition that it allows an opening to the other. So each flat has a contact with an intimate garden, a common garden, and a public space. And each exterior is a connection and not a separation. So it's what makes the density of operation and quality of life. So this garden connects neighbors who might never met in fact, because they don't take the same route to their home. So from one neighbor to the next, everyone knows each other. So this operation has been going for 10 years, and there is an incredible atmosphere because the doors of the intimate gardens are always open in summer, and in France it's something very rare. A sort of a trust between inhabitants appeared over time. So when an operation is delivered a few years later, we go back to the site and meet the inhabitants. And each project we visit is an opportunity to learn from what to do and imagine other devices. So this is an intimate garden, tense between the two rooms. And this is rooms on the other side of the garden. And I will talk about a story. For example, one day I was visiting the operation, and a single father to whom I asked what he had done with that room detached on the other side of the garden, and he answered me, the living room. So I was surprised, and I asked him why, and he said, I receive my daughter every other weekend, which is very little. So I'm torn between the idea of going out and going to movies or restaurant with her. But being a father is also living together. So we made the living room on the other side of the garden so we can go out together, but at home. So something absolutely unexpected for architects. So to conclude, and by way of comparisons, these two projects have a comparable density from 120 to 160 dwellings per hectare that are quite high urban densities, but each one develops very different qualities of intimacy, of sharing, but also very different urban forms. So the second project shows us an sort of unedited urban form. We can imagine it if we think about it from the big scale. It results from a reflection on an even smaller scale that is than the dwelling, but from intimate spaces. So I mean that we can think and make the density from its smaller scale, from sort of a domestic dimension, and propose a large panel of a way of life, and depending on the context, so a sort of point of view of the city, which would be a view from the inside, like a sort of domestic city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And our final speaker, Christoph Houtin, who's an architect and researcher from Bordeaux, where his practices, but over many years he's also documented and studied the townships in South Africa. That's very much informed and kind of driven some of his interest in housing and environmental and economic development. And his name will no doubt be familiar to you as one of the co-architects with Lacaton Vassal and Frédéric Drouot of the Grand Park housing in Bordeaux that won the 2019 Mies van der Rohe Prize. And as you'll see there, you might be wondering what is in the background, but Christoph is also the curator of the French Pavilion in this year's Venice Architecture Biennale, which is in the process of installation. So very kindly, he is coming in to us from Venice. Over to you, Christoph.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the University of Sydney, the School of Architecture, and Jean-Philippe for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share the work and the ideas with you tonight for you and this morning for me. I'm going to introduce you a research and development project I did a few years ago, and there is two phases. So I'm going to show the two phases. The first one is built, and the second one is unbuilt. The name is Au Plateau. The goal of this project is to make like a structure where the people can build freely housing. First, I must introduce this scheme to explain that in France, usually for young people, when you want to get a house to make your home, you have to, if you want to get a piece of land to build a house, you have to move far away from the city center and from the services of the city for the transport, the school, etc. So the problem is the people to be able to buy a house, they have to move 30 kilometers or more than that from the city. So I wanted to try to make the same quality that you can find 30 kilometers away from the city for the same amount of money, how you can live close to the services and the city. So for that, you have to reduce the footprint, of course, to save the cost of the land and also to avoid the urban sprawl. So we tried to work on that structure and also to promote the density and to challenge a little bit also the question of the density and the quality of life, of housing. The both can work together, and also it's a way also to bring social mixity in the city and biodiversity. And the last point I want to talk today is also about the freedom. My point of view on housing policy is that usually in architecture, we are going too far in the way we are designing housing. Because sometimes the home and the house doesn't work together. A house for me, it's the place where you build your project of life, and the diversity of each single person doesn't accept to get a standard and general answer to housing. So the people must have the possibility and the capacity also to build and to transform the daily life, and so to bring architecture, make architecture more comfortable for them and more suitable. So this is the two projects I'm presenting. So it's close to a city called Bordeaux. It's the name of the city is a suburb of Bordeaux. It's Bègle. The project was done with in partnership with the municipality and also a research center with a big French brand of concrete, who was helping us about the load and the engineering approach. So the building on the left is the first phases. This project was done with a social housing company, but it's not done to be rent, it's done to be sold. So in France, the legal system to make a social housing, you have to before to build, you have to prove that you are reaching a level of energy efficiency. So you have to do the skin of the building, the facade. And on the second phase, you will see I wanted to go forward and to let the people build themselves the houses. So there is a story behind this project. I'm not starting from white pages. It's a long story in the 20th century about structuralism. The first sketch I'm showing you is from James Wines. And he tried to do like a house shelf. And as you can see, it's very dense. And the goal for him, I suppose, was to leave the people, to let the people breathe themselves in a different way. After that, in the 80s, in Berlin, Fraiotto did this building. For example, in this one, there is 18 houses, and Fraiotto did the concrete structure. And it's a very good example about the meeting between the skill of the architecture and the performance of the inhabitants. So each family built in a different way with different spaces and different technical approach. Here you can see on the left Fraiotto discussing with the people about how to manage and to mix the different projects. I have met the woman with the green shirt, and a few years ago, it's very interesting to see how it was very precise to answer of the desire of the people. It's very interesting. Also, there is another try in Japan, in Osaka. It's also it's also 18, I think, units, and it's a concrete structure where you can remove the floor and the inside partition when the people are moving, when they are turning inside the building. You can change completely the way to organize your housing unit. So this is the first phase of the project Au Plateau. So it's a concrete building with, you can see as a pyramid with décalage between the different floors. And the shame at the beginning was, the ambition was very simple. It was to when you've got in gray, you're having the square meter that you buy. But in reserve, you've got a potential of extension, and you've got also a garden. So in each floor, you will find a terrace, a big terrace, where you can extend and change the organization of the unit. And you've got also a real garden with 30 centimeters of earth to plant and to make your garden. I show you an example of one unit. So it's you have to answer about typology. So this one is a 2-bedroom apartment, and the size is 110 square meter. And you can see that you're having a garden, and you're having also, I don't know if you see here, you're having some space in reserve that you can transform. And the inside partition is done also by the people themselves. Here's an example about in different in the first floor, for example, what kind of organization you can find, and what is the cost of the units. It's just an example. We didn't provide the plan for the people. The last 2 stories are duplex units, because it's going to be fine on the higher level. So on the ground floor, you're having very deep and large apartment, and when you go higher, they are becoming smaller. It's not a question of typology and a number of space, but a question of deep and size and capacity. Here you can see where the garden is coming and the terrace. So the people can choose also the type of soil, where they put the kitchen, where they can arrange as they want. It's like an improvisation. Also, you can see that there is in the middle of the facade, there is a column as to be able also to make a partition or to divide the space if they want to make more bedrooms. So you can see the garden and the terrace. And this is a few years later. where when the people get in and the plants are growing and the life also is entering the building, and the life of the people is growing also. So the people transform, they change the apartment. Sometimes they call me to ask me if it's okay to change, to make more bedroom or to transform. And of course it's okay, because usually in architecture we consider that end of the project is when you finish the construction. We said, okay, the project is over. But I think it's a mistake, because for me, the project starts when you finish the construction. Because to make your house, it's never finished. It's like the non finito of Michelangelo. You have to dream and to desire to make your home and to make your house differently every day. Is what the people are doing. It's universal. So this is the way the people are making the interior organization and the taste of the people. You can play this kind of game also. And this one, for example, is on the first floor. And you can see that you're having a shelter for animals. You've got your grass very clean. People are paying a lot of attention to the house. It's wonderful. So this is the starting point. And you see the plants are growing very fast. And year after year, everything is growing. The life is coming. And you can see on the high level, the last level, there is a lot of terrace and reserve space where the people can continue also to build them. It was a strategy for me also to make this project more affordable for people, because when you provide the terrace, you can sell it very less price than a finished unit. So it's a way also to make it more affordable. And this is the second phase of the project. So I wanted to try to make like the I see in Frayoto and other experimental approach and project in the past. I wanted to make it work in the French legacy, and it was not simple in terms of legal approach. And the goal was to use an housing estate legal organization system, and to superimpose the plot. So the higher between two floors are 6 meters, so you can build a two-story housing unit inside. And as you can see in this sketch, you can build different way. The concrete floor is having a very strong capacity, and you can put punctual or linear load everywhere you want on the structure. So you can divide also the structure. People can buy the size they want. This is just to illustrate what I'm saying. This is the volume. In fact, in this project, we were the people were selling volume and not area. The passageway also to deliver the entrance of the apartment is a public space, and we just provide the floor and the services, the energy, the water, like in a street in a housing estate. We were using exactly the same legal system. So this building was the project was unbuilt because the mayor of the town retired. He left his function, So he was not carrying the project anymore. So after that, the project stopped, because in fact, when you are doing this kind of approach, you have to be supported by municipality or by politic, and to reach that point. And I'm just finishing with this picture to show you that this is the marketing images were done to sell the plot. And in fact, the goal was to sell exactly the price, the same quantity of and the same capacity to build, then 30 kilometers away, as I was saying, and to sell it with the same price. So it was around 120,000 euro. This is the price of a plot outside of the city, very far away. And this plot is into the city, related to the tramway, the public transport, and to school and all the services. Thank you.
Thank you all. We're going to be joined by Anne and Jean-Philippe for this discussion. And while, please, everybody do, thank you for a really rich conversation. I think there's a lot of questions and a lot to be had here. So I want to invite everyone in the audience here with me tonight, but also online, to send in questions. And I've got Catherine Lassen here, who's going to field them through. So if you are putting them onto the chat, we will hopefully have time for them. But while you think of them, I thought I might just pick up on one question and to start off. And in some ways, this was something that was quite burning from last night as well. And it picks up, Christoph, I think what you said, which was the project starts when the construction finishes. And there was a lot of questions that came in last night, actually asking, how did the inhabitants respond? I think Anne and Jean-Philippe, you spoke a lot about talking to them in the early stages and how the building has started to live. And I was interested also, Sophie, in what you were talking about, the different plans you had, the room that could be used in so many different configurations, and how these inhabitants, the tenants, those people who start to occupy it, started to understand the relationship between how they use and function, what it is to live, and the spaces that they were in, and whether that was something that was fixed or whether they started to play with it themselves, whether you were engaged in that conversation, what you've thought about. Christoph, also, I think, thinking about from stage one to what you learnt and saw that then informed the hope to be, maybe perhaps soon to be, and Irene also as to what has happened in the life of this building since the 60s and how it has been used, appropriated by people over time. And just to talk a little bit about, I guess, the lived experience of these buildings as you now see them. Someone. Maybe.
I don't know, so who, Christoph?
You want to answer first, huh?
Oh. Maybe we start with, as he's frozen, maybe Anne and Jean-Philippe, you can start, because in some ways it was a question that was hanging from last night very much as well.
Okay, perhaps very, very, very quickly. I don't know, perhaps we cannot hear Christoph. I think it's about freedom. In all the examples that we showed this morning, I think this idea of freedom is really important. Most of the time, we are obliged to work really based on the realization of the essential functions. And there is never one function that for me is extremely important that is defined as freedom. What is the space that takes in consideration this function that is freedom? And at this moment, and we see the freedom in this additional space in Sophie project, or in the capacity that is given by the project of Christoph, also in the diversity that we see in the project of Renaudie, and also with these spaces of gardens, nature that creates other spaces. And we see then that there is a sort of more freedom than in the standard. And because there is more freedom than in the standard, it gives the possibility for the inhabitants to really inhabit and to develop their own creativity then. And for me, it is what makes the relation between all these projects.
If I may add something to continue this discussion, it's clear that in the three presentations, we saw different typologies of which are really out of standards. And Irene reported a phrase of words of Renaudie, who said something like, typical types make typical inhabitants. But in a way, it's clear that very unique or exceptional typologies make a more interesting space. But saying that, it's clear that it doesn't count on the creativity and the personality of the people. And the lessons that we took from all the transformation and all the existing 60s buildings that we did, where there are only a few typologies and always the same. And the lesson we took from that, it's that many people have the ability to get rid of the constraint of the typology and can make a great diversity in spite of the rigidity of the typology. So also it's a great lesson, and probably it's it's also our opinion that what finally makes or gives the freedom to inhabitants to take this freedom or to take this possibility of appropriation. And it's clear for us that probably more than the diversity in typology is how to create the conditions of freedom. And for us, it's also much more the issue of extra space, of unprogrammed space that can create this diversity of occupation and of life.
Yes, for my part, I discovered some things very interesting. For example, some inhabitants change the places of the furnitures with the seasons. So they inhabit this space like this in winter and like that in summer. So it's something that makes a dwelling very lively dwelling because of the exterior spaces too, and the unprogrammed.
Yeah, clear.
Christoph, you were lost.
Yes, yeah, I'm back. I was supposed to answer about the life and my computer died. So I have to use another one. I'm sorry about that. And yes, I think as Anne was saying, what is very important also is I think in architecture, usually when we are working on housing issue, the answer are always very determined in the way we are designing the inside and the house. So the goal of the project I was showing and what is very efficient in the work of Anne and Jean-Philippe that I can sometimes when I'm visiting the housing that are doing, it's a lot of things are completely unexpected, and the life is going forward than what was planned at the beginning. And sometimes you can be very surprised, as Sophie also was saying in this project, is the people are transforming a lot, and they are the proper expert of the housing is the people, the inhabitants is not the architect. So we have to bring back this freedom to the people when we are designing. Maybe we have to design less when we are doing housing and to give more space and more freedom.
And Irene, how has it played out in Ivry-sur-Seine?
I mean, the issue of freedom, I think, has come very much to the front in progressive housing architecture, at least in the West. And to my mind, the ideal would be that the fabric itself of housing would have, I'm using the words, I suppose, very broadly and perhaps metaphorically, would have a certain kind of softness, so that inhabitants can actually interfere with everything which the dwelling is made of. I just give very briefly, one example, which is a house in which I am currently living. It has been messed around for the last 150 years and in every possible imaginable way. Coming back to the present and the West, I think that what is difficult is that we build in materials which are quite rigid, and we tend to also use models which are enduring because of the way the market is organized, so that we have to actually provide the freedom in, as Christoph has said, and Anne also has said, in supplementary spaces which are outside the conventional part of the dwelling. And to me, it is great, but I wish we could actually take this further to the whole dwelling. And there is also a further restriction, which is in the West, which is the way we think of public housing. And public housing that is a tenant has inevitably responsibilities to the next tenants and is restricted for that reason by the municipalities. And so there are certain things which cannot be changed. And so the freedom is much easier to obtain in private housing, where people can do more or less what they want, at least with the interior of the dwelling. And so there, I think in the West, there are great limitations to that freedom, which in the work, for instance, that Christoph has done in Soweto, in South Africa, obviously none of this applies. And where the freedom which is shown in the photographs, for instance, behind your head, it's much more compelling. And in a way appears paradoxically, not in terms of wealth, but as a kind of aspiration for us all. And perhaps we are back to the vernacular, to the enormous hold with which vernacular architecture continue to exercise, I think, in the architecture of the West, precisely for those kind of reasons. That is a freedom which, being fully responsible of the house in which we live, actually gives us in shaping our future.
We have a question coming in online, while everyone here in the audience thinks of some too. No? I've got some more. But...
Hi, can you hear me? So this is a question from Matt Stark, and he says, Australian housing buyers often put the resale value of a house before their own wants. Are French buyers more adventurous? How is market acceptance of these products relative to a typical product?
Christoph, you can reply. Or?
Yes, I can reply to the question that I understood. I'm not sure I understood clearly the question, but I will try to answer. You will tell me if I'm okay. the subject that Irene also is saying is when you do a specific answer to people is non-conventional. You provide non-conventional unit. So for the market, it's quite difficult. It's always what the people are saying to me. But it's difficult after to rent or to sell it because it's very different. My answer is very simple. When you want to rent, when I was a student, I was renting apartment in a historical neighborhood in my city. And when you visit an apartment, what are the criteria to choose it? What is charming you when you visit an apartment? Is the difference of this apartment that is charming you? Is the story of the people before you? They determine in another way a place to live. So you can enter easily this story and project your own story in this apartment because it was used before. And so you can continue that story. And so what is different in an apartment is what is charming you. So there is no problem to make a non-conventional housing unit because for me it's easier to rent than to sell because there is a story and a quality that you cannot reach in a standard.
But yes, but what part of the question was, if I understand, the acceptance of the clients to develop those projects, right?
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting thing to go into. It would
Yeah,
be quite good to
but
talk about
it's clear that it only remains for now exceptional experiences. But in a way, it's extremely important that all these experiences can be built and not just remain in a kind of utopia of housing. And we can see that for now, they are not totally infused the word of the clients, but we start to have a numerous number of this experience. And in fact, we can see also that in the last year has also radically changed the discussion about that, because it was clear that due to the lockdown and we had to stay at home, that it was clear that this situation has not revealed, because it was the same before, but as really pointed out, that everyone was, many people were not well in their dwelling because it was too restricted. There was not this freedom that we can expect. So and of course, after this period, the good examples are also pushed in front. So we can expect that it might change a little in the next future. But what is extremely important is not to give up and to say we have to push these experiences, because step by step they do a kind of corpus of not new models, because model is not the right name, but it makes a good amount of experience.
And perhaps just to complete, because there was this, for example, yesterday we showed the case study house program in US. That was a very social housing program in the 50s. And now these villas are extremely expensive. In Berlin, the project of Frei Otto, it was based, that Christoph shows, was done in a very, very non-standard way. And today it is a place where the apartments are really expensive. So it means that we could also say that good architecture never lose value.
Irene, I think you.
Yeah, I think one of the issues which we have to face when we design housing in the West is that, or in wealthy countries, is that people might not necessarily be interested in spending so much time changing their house, perhaps because they have busy life in other ways. So in other words, our situation is actually very different from the situation of people maybe in Soweto, though I have never been to Soweto. And I think in this respect, the work of Sophie is extremely interesting because I think Sophie, and perhaps especially the project in Dijon, could be seen as a kind of intermediate solution where there is an acceptance of the idea of type, which would be very reassuring to developers, while at the same time there is a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between, on the one hand, type, and on the other, the capacity for inhabitants to actually interpret and change the organization of their life within this particular type. And for me, the big question is whether, as Anne put it earlier on, whether the proliferation of differences in the field of housing is in a way doomed to remain marginal in the future for reasons which might be to do partly with the economy, or whether one can, in which case actually type will continue to be the reality of the day, or whether it can be actually generalized, and if so, to what extent. My hunch, I must say, is that type, for a number of reasons, will continue in the West to be the dominant way of procuring housing. And for reasons to do with the conservative of various disposition of various professions, and for reasons to do with economy, and all kinds of things. But I like to be thought that I might be wrong, but on the other hand, I like Sophie's work, so I'm torn.
So you have here 3 examples of architects who don't think like you. And we are absolutely convinced that we can reverse the principle. And also it's important today to count on the pressure of the inhabitants, which probably was not the same some time ago, because now the people, they have expectations. And for example, today in Paris, after just in the pandemic, many people, they leave their apartments to go somewhere else. So when all these owners will have on the hand empty dwellings, because these dwellings doesn't correspond anymore to the expectations of the inhabitants, probably something will change in their approach of doing housing.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, I think the question is, to what extent and how fast this position was changed. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm interested in, one of the reasons why I am interested in old building stock is that old building stock, it's much easier to modify than mass housing in such a way that it has been done in the last, say, 50 years. Mm-hmm. And, the streets of London, where I am, are very repetitive. And you could say that they are built on the idea of type. You have a certain kind of terrace house in which all, if you look on the outside, are similar. So reality is actually much more complex and much more interesting, that the interior of the house have been messed around to sometimes extreme degrees, and sometimes, in fact, very often, by changing a house into apartments, for instance, and occasionally also vice versa. So there is a type. So I must say that the type itself tends to be modified in the course of time. The types itself evolve in the actual house, under indeed the pressure of the inhabitants. Yeah, in other words, the inhabitants have a role to play in this, which I think is very significant, in the same way as, of course, providers have a role to play. Yeah.
Can I pick up on something that Anne pointed out? I think that became very evident in the projects we were looking at, which was also the fact that, Sophie, it's you were going against, as you said, what is the general norm within the system, planning system in France, and as was Christoph, you're going against a system that was there, and I wondered what the conditions that enabled each of your projects to be as successful as they were, or to get these new ideas into the forum, what those conditions were. Was it the way in which you as architects operated? Was it the kind of relationships you developed? What were the kind of hurdles you had to overcome, and how did you do it?
For my part, it was for the first project I presented. It was a very nice relation with the client, with the lawyer Meyer, and he accepted our sort of protocols of method about to talk about the dwellings, and he accepted to associate the group of the how do you call les personnes qui gèrent le patrimoine. The managers who are in relation with the inhabitants. So we could have very interesting discussions that were really open. So it was interested to think about dwellings who could be different, not to be different, but to be more accorded to the way of life of his inhabitants. So I think the relationship with the client can make a good project. If you don't have it, it's more difficult. Mm-hmm. And in those two projects, these are rental dwellings. So it's quite something difficult because in France, I don't know if it's the same in other countries, but when you rent a dwelling, when you go away, you change, you have to give back the dwelling in the same form that when you come in. So there is no history for the future dwellings. That makes this sort of charming situation there, which Christoph talked about. So it's something. It's sterile. It's
sterile.
Sterile. It's yes, it's sterilized sort of quality of inhabited spaces.
And Christoph, what was that, do you think, that enabled, it was again the client, yeah.
I can say a few words also to answer. Of course, you know that to make an interesting project and to carry out an ambition, you need a good client and good people in front of you. They understand and they share with you the idea and the ambition you want to develop. And it's not a question of system, in fact, because as you can see, with the same system, the phase 1 and phase 2 of the project I was developing, because the person changed, we could not reach the second point. We were very close to do it. We were contracted with the company to build, but the person changed, and so the project became another project, and it was more a fight than a project. So you need people understanding and sharing ideas to make a project. This is the most important. And also in terms of housing, what I consider, I do one critique is sometimes you deal with people who are experts of housing. And this is the worst thing that you can find to make a housing project is to work with experts. Because the inhabitants are experts and not a professional.
Yeah.
That's perhaps a very nice way to, I think we're over time to do it, but it is perhaps a very nice way. It's not the architects who know everything, it's the inhabitants from whom we can learn. And I wish we could have bring everybody together here. For those of you who weren't able to join the session today, we had 3 Melbourne architects talking about really interesting projects as well, who are also pushing the boundaries, sometimes almost acting as clients, putting themselves and their own money forward, different economic and sort of then structures, thinking about the home as a place also with a lot of shared spaces. And it makes a really interesting, wonderful combination actually of the 3 projects we've seen today and the 3 we saw at lunchtime. So, and I understand that with time difference, they are all online, as is Anne and Jean-Philippe's lecture last night that we've been referring to. It's nothing worse than referring to something you might not have heard, but you can see them all online. And I think this is very much just the start of a discussion that will continue in this symposium, but also over the next 3 years as Anne and Jean-Philippe have their special chair here at the University of Sydney, which is very special thanks to Gary and Susan Rothwell. So hopefully this is just the beginning of a long conversation that will start to hopefully embrace the kind of this moment, as you say, Anne, that the pandemic has perhaps offered us as an opportunity to rethink the future. So thank you very much to our speakers and to those who have come tonight to join us, and to those who have joined us online. And one final thanks to them all.